Welcome to this journey through one of the most unsettling and unexplained cases ever documented in the American history. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time at which you're listening to this narration. We are interested to know how far these documented accounts reach and at what moments of day or night they find their listeners. They said a black boy born in chains could never understand the language of iron and gears. They said his kind was built for picking cotton, not building machines. They were so sure of this that when James stood before them with grease on his hands and a working contraption made from plantation trash, the white engineers laughed in his face. They called him a liar, a thief. They said he must have stolen their designs, the same designs that had failed for 3 weeks straight. But when that machine roared to life and processed more cotton in 10 minutes than their best workers could in an hour, the laughter died. And in that silence, something shifted. Because the boy they said was property had just proven he understood something they never could. This is the story of how one enslaved child with nothing but scraps and genius brought a southern plantation to its knees and made grown men with engineering degrees question everything they thought they knew about who deserved to be free. Before we continue with this shocking story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment which city you're listening from. Let's strengthen our community together. Thank you. And now back to the story. Whitfield Plantation sat in the Fertile Crescent of central Alabama, about 40 miles south of Montgomery. The property stretched across nearly 2,000 acres of rich, dark soil that had been growing cotton since 1798. 3 generations of Whitfields had worked this land, and 3 generations of enslaved families had bled into it. By 1865, the plantation was home to 147 enslaved people, a big house with white columns that could be seen from the main road, and a reputation for producing some of the finest long staple cotton in the state. The land itself rolled gently with the main fields occupying the flattest sections near Kai Creek. The creek ran year-round, providing water for irrigation and power for the old mill that ground corn and wheat. Oak trees lined the drive up to the big house, their branches forming a canopy that kept the family cool in summer. But back behind the fields, past the cotton gin and the storage barns, that was where the quarters stood. 23 cabins made of rough-cut pine arranged in 2 rows facing each other. No trees for shade, no canopy to cool the air, just bare ground packed hard by decades of feet, walking the same paths to the same forced labor. In the 3rd cabin from the north end, that was where Rosie lived with her son James. The cabin measured 12 foot x 14 feet, 1 room for everything: sleeping, cooking, living, dying. The walls were bare pine boards with gaps wide enough to see through. When it rained, water came in through the roof and turned the dirt floor to mud. When winter came, the cold crept through every crack and settled in your bones. There was a fireplace made of clay and sticks that smoked so bad your eyes watered. But it was the only source of heat and the only place to cook the meager rations they received each week. The roof was patched with pieces of tin and tar paper that Rosie had scavenged over the years, but it still leaked in a dozen places. During heavy storms, they had to move their sleeping pallets around to avoid the worst of the water. The floor was dirt packed hard from years of feet, and in the summer, it turned to dust that got into everything: your food, your lungs, your hair. Those rations were calculated down to the ounce. Each adult received 3.5 pounds of salt pork or bacon per week, along with a peck of cornmeal. That was it. No vegetables unless you could grow them in the small plots behind the cabins. No fruit unless you could steal it. No milk, no butter, no sugar. Children received half rations until they were old enough to work full days in the fields. Rosie had learned to stretch those portions in ways that defied mathematics. She made corn cakes that were more water than meal. She boiled the salt pork until the bones were soft enough to eat. She foraged for wild greens in the woods when the overseer was not watching. She caught crawfish in the creek with her bare hands. She knew which tree bark could be ground into flour when the cornmeal ran out. And still there were nights when James went to sleep with his stomach cramping from hunger. Nights when he dreamed of food and woke up to nothing but the same empty bowl that had been empty the night before. The value of an enslaved person at Whitfield Plantation was written in Master Whitfield's ledger kept locked in his study. A prime field and male aged 20 to 35 was worth between $1,200 and $1,500. A woman of childbearing age was worth slightly less, maybe $1,000. But her value increased with each child she produced because each child was future property. Children under 10 had little monetary value because they could not yet work full days. They were investments cost to be managed until they could earn their keep. James, at his birth in 1857, was assigned a value of $50, the same as a young mule. Rosie remembered the day the appraiser came through the quarters, writing numbers in his book next to each person's name. He had looked at baby James, checked his limbs for deformities, listened to his breathing, then scratched $50 in his ledger without another thought. That was what her son's life was worth to these people. $50, less than the cost of the suit Master Whitfield wore to church. But Rosie knew her son was worth more than any number in any ledger. She saw it in the way he watched everything. While other children played, James studied. He studied the way the wagon wheels turned. He studied the hinges on the barn doors. He studied the pulley system that lifted water from the well. His eyes were always moving, always learning, always trying to understand how things worked. And that terrified her because curiosity in a slave child was dangerous. Questions led to beatings. Thinking led to suspicion. Intelligence was a threat to the order of things. She had seen it before. Smart children who asked too many questions, who showed too much potential, they disappeared. Sold south to the sugar plantations in Louisiana where the life expectancy was measured in years, not decades. Or they got broken, beaten so badly and so often that the light went out of their eyes and they became hollow shells just going through the motions of living. Rosie herself had learned this lesson at age 12 when she asked the overseer why the enslaved people could not read if reading was so important. The overseer, a man named Cyrus Pettigrew, had beaten her with a leather strap until her back was cross-hatched with welts that took weeks to heal. Then he made her stand in the hot sun for 6 hours without water as an example to the others. Knowledge is for white folks, he told her while the strap fell again and again. Your kind needs strong backs, not smart mouths. From that day forward, Rosie learned to hide her thoughts behind a mask of compliance. Sir. Oh, sir. Whatever you say, sir. Thank you, sir. She learned to make herself small, invisible, unthreatening. It was the only way to survive. But inside, behind the mask, her mind never stopped working. She remembered everything, every injustice, every cruelty, every moment of degradation. And she promised herself that if she ever had children, she would teach them how to survive in a world that wanted them dead. She tried to teach James the same lesson, but the boy could not help himself. When he was 5 years old, he asked the blacksmith why heating metal made it easier to bend. The blacksmith, an enslaved man named Marcus, who had been working iron for 30 years, looked around nervously before answering. Heat makes the metal softer, boy. Makes the molecules move around more so they can slide past each other. Now stop asking questions before you get us both whipped. But James could not stop. His mind worked like one of the machines he studied. Always turning, always processing. Why did the water wheel turn? Why did some woods burn hotter than others? Why did metal rust? Why did the cotton gin have teeth arranged in that particular pattern? Why did the plow blade curve that way? Why did the wagon need grease on the axles? Every day brought new questions, and Rosie lived in constant fear that one of those questions would be overheard by the wrong person. Every day began the same way. The bell rang at 4:30 in the morning, a harsh clang that cut through the darkness and pulled people from whatever small bit of rest they had managed to find. The bell was mounted on a post in the center of the quarters, and Pettigrew rang it with obvious pleasure, swinging the rope hard enough to make the bell scream. There was no snooze button, no 5 more minutes, no mercy for the sick or the exhausted. You got up or you got the whip. Rosie would rise first, her body aching from the previous day's work, and light a small fire to heat water for corn mush. The fire starting itself was a skill. The wood was often damp, the kindling scarce. She had learned to save the driest pieces, to blow on the embers just right, to coax flame from almost nothing. James would wake to the sound of her moving in the dark, the smell of smoke, the low murmur of voices from other cabins as the quarters came reluctantly to life. He would watch her work, seeing how she did everything with economy of movement. Nothing wasted, every action purposeful. By 5 o'clock, everyone was expected to be in the fields. Men, women, children over the age of 8. The only exceptions were the house servants who worked in the big house, the blacksmith, the carpenter, and the very old or very sick who could no longer work. Everyone else went to the cotton. During planting season, you worked the soil with hoes and plows, breaking up the hard red clay until your hands bled. During growing season, you chopped weeds and thinned plants under the burning Alabama sun. During picking season, you filled sacks until your fingers bled and your back screamed, and you prayed for death just to make it stop. The workday lasted until dark, sometimes longer during harvest when the moon was bright enough to see by 12 hours, 14 hours, 16 hours during peak season. Time meant nothing except pain. The only way you knew what day it was came from the rhythm of work. Cotton picking meant fall. Plowing meant spring. The years blurred together into one long nightmare of labor. James was too young for field work until he turned 8. So he spent his early years in the care of old Ruth, a woman in her 70s who watched the small children while their parents worked. Ruth had been born on Whitfield Plantation, had lived her entire life within these boundaries, had buried 2 husbands and 5 children. 3 of her children had been sold away when Master Whitfield's father needed money to pay gambling debts. She never saw them again, never knew if they lived or died. That kind of grief does something to a person, hollows them out, or makes them harder than iron. Ruth was the hard kind. She taught the young ones how to survive. Keep your eyes down around white folks. Never talk back. Not even when they are wrong. Not even when they are lying. Never run unless you want the dogs on you. And those dogs will tear you apart before you make it a mile. Never fight back even when they hit you first because they will kill you and say you were being uppity. These were the lessons that mattered. Reading and writing were forbidden by law. But Ruth taught them other things. How to identify which plants were safe to eat. How to set a snare for rabbits. How to move through the woods without making noise. How to read the night sky for direction in case you ever got the chance to run north. Survival skills for people who were never supposed to survive. But James learned something else during those years with old Ruth. He learned that the white folks threw away treasures. Behind the big house, there was a trash pile where the Whitfield family discarded broken tools, worn-out equipment, anything that no longer served them perfectly. A hinge with a loose pin, a saw with a bent blade, a hammer with a cracked handle, a bucket with a small hole in the bottom. To them, it was garbage. The cost of replacing these items was nothing compared to the bother of fixing them. To James, it was possibility. He started collecting things when he was 6 years old. A bent nail here, a broken hinge there, a length of chain with a snapped link, a piece of leather strap from an old harness, a cracked wooden handle, a gear from some machine he could not identify. He carried these items back to the cabin and hid them under the floorboards, which were loose enough to pry up with your fingers. The space underneath was damp and smelled of earth, but it kept his treasures hidden. Rosie saw what he was doing and her heart filled with dread. "Baby, you got to stop this," she told him one night, her voice urgent and scared. "They catch you taking things from the big house, they will beat you. They will beat me. They will say you are stealing and they will make an example. Please, baby, just leave it alone." But James could not explain to her what he felt when he held those broken pieces in his hands. It was like they spoke to him in a language nobody had taught him, a language older than words. He could see how they fit together. He could imagine how they might work. He could feel the potential humming inside the metal. At night, by the weak light of a tallow candle that Rosie made from rendered pig fat, he would take out his collection and arrange the pieces in different combinations. A nail through a hole in the metal, a chain looped through the hinge, a gear meshing with another gear. His small fingers worked with a precision that seemed impossible for a child his age, testing connections, imagining movement, understanding instinctively how force and motion work together. The other enslaved people in the quarters noticed. Some thought the boy was touched in the head, that he had some kind of mental affliction that made him obsess over trash. Others thought he had a gift, maybe something spiritual, maybe something from Africa that had survived the Middle Passage and the generations of slavery. Marcus the blacksmith was the first to see real potential. He watched James one evening, saw the way the boy's hands moved with purpose, saw the concentration in his young face, saw how he was not just playing but working, solving problems, learning. "That boy got something special," Marcus told Rosie one Sunday when they had a few hours of rest. "You need to protect that." But how do you protect a gift in a place designed to crush anything that makes you different? How do you keep a light burning when everything around you is designed to snuff it out? When James turned 8 in 1865, everything changed. The war had been raging for 4 years. Everyone knew it, even though the white folks tried to keep news from reaching the quarters, but information has a way of traveling. Travelers on the road would whisper to field workers. House servants would overhear conversations and pass them along. Newspapers left lying around would be examined by those few who had secretly learned to read. You could feel the war in the tension that hung over the plantation like humidity. Master Whitfield was anxious, short-tempered, prone to fits of rage over small mistakes. His oldest son had died at Gettysburg, shot through the chest in Pickett's charge, that suicidal assault that accomplished nothing except filling graveyards. His younger son had come home with one arm missing below the elbow and a laudanum habit that grew worse every month. The boy sat on the porch of the big house all day, staring at nothing, sometimes crying, sometimes laughing at things that were not funny. The overseer carried his pistol everywhere now, even when he walked between the cabins at night, checking to make sure no one was meeting or planning or whispering about freedom. There were rumors flying through the quarters, whispered in the dark, passed from field to field. Lincoln had freed the slaves up north. The Union was winning. Freedom was coming. But when and at what cost? Would the white folks let them go peacefully, or would there be more blood, more death, more suffering before the end? James was assigned to work in the gin house, the building where cotton was processed after picking. It was considered lighter work than field labor, suitable for children and the elderly. The gin house was a large wooden structure that smelled of cotton lint and machine oil and sweat and desperation. The gin itself was a massive contraption of wood and metal powered by a mule walking in endless circles to turn the main shaft. The mule, a gray animal named Caesar, walked the same circular path 12 hours a day, every day until he was too old and sick to continue, and then he was replaced by another mule who would walk the same path until he too broke down. Cotton went in one end of the gin, fluffy and full of seeds and bits of leaf and stem. It came out the other end cleaned, compressed, ready for market. The gin could process about 500 pounds per day when it was working well, which was not often. It jammed constantly. Parts broke, belts slipped, and when it stopped working, people were beaten because the white folks assumed someone had been careless or lazy. James' job was to feed cotton into the machine, keep the flow steady, and clear jams when they happened. It was dangerous work. The rotating drums could catch your hand if you were not careful, pull you in, crush your fingers or your whole arm. Every year, someone on some plantation lost a hand to a gin. But James was careful, and more than careful, he was fascinated. It was in the gin house that his education truly began. He watched that machine with an intensity that made the overseer nervous. "Boy, stop staring and keep working," Pettigrew would bark, his voice sharp with suspicion. But James could not help himself. He saw how the rotating drums with metal teeth grabbed the cotton and pulled it through narrow slots that were too small for the seeds to pass through. He saw how the lint was then brushed away by another set of drums rotating in the opposite direction. He saw how the cleaned cotton fell into a press where it was compressed into bales by a screw mechanism that required 2 strong men to operate. Every part of the machine had a purpose. Every movement was connected to every other movement. It was beautiful in a way he had no words to describe, beautiful the way a river is beautiful, powerful and purposeful and inevitable. During his lunch break, which was 30 minutes at noon when the heat was most oppressive, James would walk around the gin house examining the other equipment. There were spare parts stacked in corners covered with dust and cobwebs. Old gears and pulleys hanging on walls like strange decorations. A broken conveyor belt coiled like a dead snake in one corner. Barrels of oil and grease. Piles of cotton that had been rejected for various defects. And in the back, behind stacks of cotton bales that reached almost to the ceiling, there was a pile of scrap that had been accumulating for years. Broken tools, snapped chains, bent axles, cracked gears with missing teeth, shattered pulleys, twisted metal that had failed under stress. To everyone else, it was junk waiting to be hauled off and dumped somewhere. To James, it was a classroom. It was a museum. It was a treasure trove of lessons about how materials failed and why designs did not work and what happened when theory met reality. He started taking pieces from the scrap pile, small things that would not be missed. A gear the size of his palm with 3 broken teeth. A section of chain about 2 feet long with links that were stretched and deformed. A wooden pulley with a cracked wheel that would never turn smoothly again. A handful of bolts and screws of various sizes. A piece of iron bar about a foot long bent at one end. He hid them in a burlap sack that he kept tucked behind his workstation, and he carried them back to the cabin each night, terrified that Pettigrew would stop him and demand to know what he was carrying, but the overseer never did. Why would he? What use did a slave child have for broken machinery? What threat could a boy pose with a handful of scrap metal? In the cabin at night, after Rosie had fallen into exhausted sleep, her body finally giving up the fight to stay conscious, James would take out his collection by candlelight and work. He had no proper tools except a rusty file he had found in the trash and a flat rock he used as a hammer. But his hands were clever, and his mind was cleverer. He learned that if you heated a nail in the fire until it glowed red, you could bend it to any shape you wanted while it was hot, and it would hold that shape when it cooled. He learned that you could smooth rough metal by rubbing it against stone for hours, creating surfaces that fit together almost perfectly. He learned that different woods had different strengths: oak strong but hard to work, pine easy to carve but weak, hickory flexible and good for handles. He learned that wire could be twisted into shapes that were stronger than the wire itself. These were lessons no one taught him. They came from trial and error, from countless failures, from refusing to give up even when nothing worked, even when his fingers were bloody and his eyes burned from strain and exhaustion. His first creation was simple but meaningful: a small wheel made from a wooden disc he had carved from a piece of oak, mounted on an axle made from a thick nail he had straightened and filed smooth, suspended in a frame made from bent wire he had scavenged from a broken basket. When you spun the wheel, it turned freely with minimal friction. That was all it did. It served no practical purpose, but to James, it was proof that he could take broken things and make them work again. It was proof that his ideas could become reality. He showed it to Rosie one morning before work, his face bright with pride. "Mama, look, I made it myself. I made it spin." Rosie held the little contraption in her work-roughened hands, hands that were scarred and calloused from decades of cotton and corn and endless labor, and felt tears sting her eyes. It was wonderful and terrible at the same time. Wonderful because her son had genius in his fingers. Terrible because genius in a slave was dangerous. Terrible because she knew that in this world a black child with too much intelligence was a target. "Baby," she said softly, trying to keep her voice steady, "you cannot show this to anyone. You understand? No one. Not the other folks, not Marcus. Nobody. If they find out you can do this, they will use you up and throw you away like they do everything else. Or worse, they will sell you down to the deep south, down to Louisiana or Mississippi, where they work people to death in the sugar fields in 2 years. I have heard the stories. Please, baby, promise me you will keep this hidden." James promised. But even as the words left his mouth, his mind was already racing ahead to the next thing he wanted to build. He could not stop himself. It was like hunger. This need to create, to understand, to make things work. It was like breathing. He could no more stop building than he could stop his heart from beating. The months passed, and James's collection grew. The space under the floorboards was packed with parts organized into categories that made sense only to him: gears sorted by size, chains and belts in another section, screws and bolts separated by length and thickness, pieces of leather, lengths of rope, bits of glass, shards of metal, springs, hinges, brackets. Every piece was examined, catalogued in his mind, understood for its potential. He could close his eyes and see the entire inventory, could reach under the floorboards in the dark and pull out exactly the piece he needed. And slowly, project by project, night after night, he taught himself the principles of mechanics. Leverage, how a long lever could move a heavy weight with little effort. Torque, how rotational force worked differently than straight-line force. Gear ratios, how different sized gears could change speed and power. Friction, how different surfaces resisted motion in different ways. Weight distribution, how balance affected stability. These were not words he knew, but he understood the concepts in his bones, through experimentation and observation and intuition. He built a pulley system that could lift a bucket of water from the floor to the ceiling using a quarter of the effort. He built a wheeled cart from scrap wood and old wagon wheels that could carry twice the load of a regular basket. He built a trigger mechanism that could snap a stick in half when you pulled a string, the tension stored in a bent piece of metal, releasing all at once. He built a small press that could flatten pieces of metal by amplifying force through a screw mechanism. None of these things had any practical use in the cabin, but they proved something important. They proved that James understood how the physical world worked. They proved that his mind could solve problems that most adults could not even conceptualize. They proved that he had a gift that went beyond normal intelligence, something rare, precious, and dangerous. Marcus the blacksmith was the first person outside the cabin to learn James's secret. It happened by accident one evening in late summer. Marcus had been walking past their cabin on his way back from the forge when he heard a strange clicking sound, rhythmic and mechanical. He peered through a gap in the boards and saw James working on something by candlelight, his small hands moving with the confidence and precision of a trained craftsman. The boy was maybe 9 years old, and he was assembling a complex mechanism with gears and levers, his face intense with concentration. Marcus watched for several minutes, mesmerized, before quietly walking away. He said nothing that night, but the next day he pulled James aside near the forge when no one else was around. "Boy, I seen what you been doing last night. Don't worry, I ain't going to tell nobody. But you need to be more careful. You need to work quieter, and if you ever need help understanding how metal works, you come find me when it is safe. I will teach you what I can. But we got to be smart about it." That was how James learned to work iron. Marcus could not teach him openly because teaching slaves was forbidden, punishable by law. But he found ways. He would leave the forge unattended at certain times, knowing James would sneak in during his lunch break. He would work on projects and talk out loud to himself, explaining each step in a voice just loud enough for the boy hiding in the shadows to hear. "This metal here, it is high-carbon steel. Gets harder when you heat it up and then cool it quick in water. We call that quenching. But if you cool it too fast, it will crack and be useless. You got to know the color. Cherry red for bending. That's around 1,300 degrees. Orange for welding. That's hotter, maybe 1,500 degrees. Yellow means too hot. You will burn the metal and ruin it. Watch the color, not the clock. The metal will tell you when it is ready." Marcus was risking a beating or worse to pass on his knowledge. But he did it anyway because he saw something in James that gave him hope. Maybe this boy would live to see freedom. Maybe this boy would do something extraordinary. Maybe all their suffering was not for nothing. By the spring of 1865, the plantation was in chaos. The war was ending and everyone could feel it in their bones. Master Whitfield was desperate in a way that made him unpredictable and dangerous. Cotton prices had crashed because Union blockades had cut off exports to England and France. Half his wealth was tied up in Confederate bonds that were now worthless, just fancy paper with pictures of dead politicians. His oldest son was dead, buried somewhere in Pennsylvania. His younger son was alive but broken, addicted to laudanum and unable to manage anything. The plantation that had made the Whitfield family rich for 3 generations was on the edge of collapse. The buildings needed repairs. The equipment was breaking down. The fields were less productive because the soil had been depleted by decades of cotton monoculture. And Whitfield knew that when the Union won, and everyone knew they would win eventually, he would lose everything. Not just the war, not just the money, but the labor force that had built his entire world. 147 people who would walk away the moment they were legally free to do so. 147 people who knew where he lived, who knew his habits, who had reasons to hate him that went back generations. That fear kept him awake at night. That was when the engineers arrived. 3 white men from Montgomery, hired by Whitfield to solve a problem that money alone could not fix. The cotton gin, though functional, was slow and outdated. It could process about 500 pounds of cotton per day when it was running well. Whitfield wanted a new design that could double or triple that output. If he could increase production dramatically before the war ended, maybe he could stockpile enough cotton to survive the financial collapse everyone knew was coming. Maybe he could sell it when prices recovered. Maybe he could salvage something from the ruins. The engineers set up in the gin house, spreading blueprints across a makeshift table made of sawhorses and planks, arguing about gear ratios and drive mechanisms and power sources. They had impressive credentials. They'd studied at universities. They used technical language that sounded authoritative and precise. They drew elaborate diagrams with straight edges and compasses. They calculated forces and velocities and deficiencies with mathematical formulas. James watched them from a distance, pretending to work while his eyes followed every movement. The engineers were educated men in a way that James could barely imagine. They had training. They had books. They had access to accumulated knowledge going back centuries. They used words like torque and mechanical advantage and rotational velocity and coefficient of friction. They argued about physics and mathematics and material science. And yet, as the days turned into weeks, they produced nothing that worked. Their first design stripped its gears on the second day of testing, the teeth snapping off under load because they had miscalculated the forces involved. Their second design jammed constantly because the clearances were too tight and cotton lint built up in the mechanism. Their third design worked for an hour before a critical belt snapped and the whole thing ground to a halt, nearly injuring 2 workers in the process. Each failure made them more frustrated, more defensive, more insistent that the problem was not their design, but the quality of the materials or the incompetence of the workers or the humidity in the air or any explanation except their own limitations. Pettigrew, the overseer, watched the failures with growing anger because he knew what they meant. Master Whitfield was spending money they did not have on engineers who could not deliver results, and that meant everyone would suffer. Rations were cut to stretch the budget. Work hours were extended to compensate for the lost productivity. The whip came out more often for smaller infractions. The whole plantation felt the pressure of those failures in the gin house, and that pressure fell hardest on the people who had the least power to resist it. James saw the problems immediately, saw them with a clarity that would have seemed impossible to anyone who knew his background. The engineers were designing on paper without understanding the reality of the materials and conditions. They were working from theory, from formulas and calculations. But they had never actually built anything with their own hands. They had never felt how metal behaved under stress. They had never dealt with the variations in wood quality. They had never compensated for the fact that cotton lint got into everything and changed how machines performed. Their gears were too fine with teeth too small and too closely spaced, which meant that any cotton lint that got into the mechanism would jam it immediately. Their belt system had no give, no flexibility for vibration, and uneven power delivery from the mule power drive shaft. Their mounting points were weak, unable to handle the torque loads that would build up during operation. These were not problems you could solve with math alone. You had to understand how machines actually behaved in the real world. You had to know that theory and practice were not the same thing. You had to have experience. At night, James began designing his own version in his head. He did not have paper or pencil, so he worked it out in 3 dimensions, imagining each part and how it would connect to the next. He used his collection of scrap parts to build small models, testing concepts on a miniature scale before committing to anything larger. Could this gear drive that shaft? Could this chain handle that load? Could this frame support that weight? What would happen if the power input varied? What if the cotton was too wet or too dry? How could you make the mechanism self-cleaning so lint did not build up? Hour after hour, night after night, while Rosie slept and the other cabins were dark, James built and tested and rebuilt, working by candlelight, his hands moving with purpose and precision. His design was elegant in its simplicity, which is often the mark of true genius. Instead of fine-tuned gears that jammed easily, he used larger teeth with wider spacing, which meant cotton lint could pass through without causing problems. Instead of a rigid belt system that would slip or break under variable loads, he used a chain drive that could handle more power and needed less maintenance. The chain had gaps between the links, so lint could not bind it up the way it bound up the engineer's belts. Instead of fighting the vibration and trying to make everything perfectly rigid, he designed mounting points that allowed controlled movement, flexible joints that absorbed shock and reduced stress on the connections. Every piece of his design addressed a real problem the engineers had overlooked or dismissed. And every piece could be built from materials already available on the plantation, salvaged from the scrap pile and the trash heap behind the big house. He would not need special metals or custom parts. He could make do with what was there, which was all he had ever done. He worked on it for 6 weeks, stealing time whenever he could, hiding his progress from everyone except Marcus, who provided occasional guidance and quiet access to the forge during times when it was supposed to be empty. The machine took shape in a corner of the quarters behind a stack of firewood where no one thought to look, covered with an old tarp. It was rough, ugly, built from trash and determination and midnight hours. The gears were mismatched sizes, scavenged from different machines that had died decades apart. The frame was a patchwork of wood and metal, held together with bolts and wire and hope. The chain was actually 3 shorter chains linked together with additional wire wound tight and then heated in the forge to fuse the connections. Nothing matched. Nothing looked professional. Nothing would have passed inspection by an engineer. But when James tested each component individually, each gear, each connection, each bearing, they all worked. The tolerances were tight enough to function, but loose enough to forgive imperfections. The design was forgiving, adaptable, robust in a way that the engineer's precise calculations could never achieve. The problem was assembly. His machine was too large to hide once it was fully assembled. Once he put it together, there would be no keeping it secret. And what would happen then? Would they accuse him of stealing? Would they destroy it out of spite or fear? Would they punish him for daring to build something without permission? For daring to think he knew better than educated white men? Would they punish Rosie for raising a child who did not know his place? The fear paralyzed him for days. He had come so far, invested so much of himself, worked so many nights until his eyes could barely focus and his fingers ached. And now he was terrified to take the final step. What if it did not work? What if he had miscalculated something? What if he was wrong and the engineers were right and he was just a foolish child playing with broken toys? It was Rosie who finally pushed him forward. She had watched her son work himself to exhaustion for weeks, had seen the fear and doubt growing in his eyes like shadows. One night she sat beside him in the cabin, the candle light making their faces look like bronze sculptures, and took his hands in hers. "Baby," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I've been scared your whole life. Scared they would hurt you. Scared they would break you. Scared they would take that beautiful mind of yours and crush it like they crush everything beautiful in this world. But I realize something. They are going to hurt us anyway. They are going to break us anyway. Fear will not protect us. It never has and it never will. The only thing that might protect us is showing them they need you more than you need them. So build your machine. Show them what you can do. Show them that they are wrong about us, about what we can do, about who we are. And maybe, Just maybe, that will keep you alive long enough to see freedom. And maybe, just maybe, other people will see what you did and realize that we are human beings just like they are. The next morning, James assembled his machine in the gin house. He worked quickly before he could lose his nerve, before anyone could stop him, before the fear could creep back in and freeze him. He carried the pieces from their hiding place behind the firewood, making multiple trips, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst. He bolted them together in a corner of the building, away from the engineers, but visible to anyone who cared to look. The frame went up first, braced against the wall for stability. Then the main shaft, mounted in wooden bearings he had carved by hand with nothing but a knife and patience. Then the gears, largest to smallest, creating the reduction ratio he needed to convert the slow rotation of the mule-powered drive shaft into the faster rotation needed for the gin drums. Then the chain drive connecting the input shaft to the output shaft, wrapped around sprockets he had fashioned from old gears with the teeth filed down to the right shape. Then the cotton feed mechanism, adapted from studying the old gin but improved with a wider throat and better spacing. Finally, the output conveyor angled to drop cleaned cotton into a collection bin with brushes to sweep the lint away from the drums. It took him 3 hours of frantic work. His hands shook from nerves and effort. His heart pounded like a hammer on an anvil. Sweat ran down his face despite the cool morning air, soaking his shirt, making his hands slippery. People stopped to watch, confused and curious and concerned. What is that boy doing? Is he building something? Where did he get those parts? Did he steal them? Should we stop him? The whispers spread through the gin house like fire through dry grass out into the yards, across the quarters, reaching every corner of the plantation. By the time James tightened the last bolt, his hands trembling so badly he almost could not grip the wrench, there was a crowd gathering. Dozens of people, enslaved and free, black and white, all staring at what this child had built from garbage. That was when the engineers noticed. They had been in the office attached to the gin house, arguing about their latest failure, blaming each other for miscalculations and faulty assumptions when someone told them a slave boy was building a machine in the corner. They came out expecting to see a child playing with scrap metal, maybe making a toy or a simple contraption that would fall apart immediately. What they saw instead stopped them cold. It was a cotton processing machine, crude but complete, built entirely from salvaged parts. The design was different from theirs, simpler in some ways, more clever in others. And it had been built by a Negro child who was not supposed to be able to read, let alone understand mechanical engineering. A child who had no formal education, no training, no access to books or blueprints or formulas. A child who was worth $50 in Master Whitfield's ledger. The lead engineer, a man named Harrison Blackwell, who had studied at the Virginia Military Institute before the war, walked up to James with his face red with anger and humiliation. "Boy," he said, his voice sharp and dangerous, "what the hell do you think you are doing? Where did you steal those designs? Did you copy our work? Did someone help you? Tell me the truth or I will have you whipped until you cannot stand. I will have you sold south where they will work you to death in the sugar fields." James stood there terrified and defiant at the same time, his whole body shaking, but his voice somehow steady, and said the only thing he could say. "Sir, I did not steal nothing. I built it myself from trash. I watched your machines break and I figured I could do better. I am sorry if that offends you, sir, but it is the truth." The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush stone. "You figured you could do better," Blackwell repeated, his voice dripping with contempt and disbelief. "You, a slave child who cannot even read, a child who probably does not even know what an engineer is. You think you can design a machine better than trained engineers who studied for years at universities. You think you know more than we do. The other two engineers laughed, the kind of laughter that comes from relief more than humor. For a moment they had been worried. For a moment they had thought maybe their entire worldview was wrong. But now they saw it was just a slave boy with delusions, with ideas above his station. The natural order had not been challenged. After all, everything was still as it should be. Blackwell turned to Pettigrew, who had rushed over when he heard the commotion, his hand already on the whip at his belt. "This boy needs to be disciplined," Blackwell said, his voice hard and cold. "He has wasted time and materials building this garbage. Worse, he has stolen our designs and is trying to take credit for our work. This is intolerable. I want him punished as an example to the others. I want him to understand that there are consequences for this kind of behavior." Pettigrew nodded, his face showing the satisfaction of a man who enjoyed his work. "I will take care of it," he said, starting to uncoil the whip. But then Master Whitfield himself appeared, drawn by the crowd and the shouting and the tension that hung in the air like static before a lightning strike. "What is going on here?" he demanded, his voice cutting through the noise. Blackwell explained the situation, painting James as a thief and a troublemaker who had dared to think he was better than his betters, who had stepped out of his place and needed to be reminded of it. Whitfield listened, his face unreadable, his eyes moving from the engineers to James to the machine and back again. Then he looked at the machine more carefully, walking around it, examining the connections, testing the stability of the frame with his hands. Then he looked at James, really looked at him, seeing him maybe for the first time as something other than property. "Boy," he said, his voice measured and careful. "Did you really build this yourself?" "Yes, sir," James said, his voice barely a whisper, his throat so tight with fear he could barely speak. "And does it work?" "I do not know, sir. I just finished putting it together. I have not tested it yet." Whitfield was quiet for a long moment, and you could see him thinking, calculating, weighing options. Then he said something that surprised everyone, even himself. "Well, let us find out. Load some cotton and start it up. If it works, we will talk about what happens next. If it does not, then Pettigrew can do his job." James' hands shook as he fed cotton into his machine. His whole world balanced on this moment. Marcus stepped forward to help, connecting a mule to the drive shaft, speaking quietly to James, giving him courage. "You did good work, boy. This will work. I have seen you build. You know what you're doing. Trust yourself." The mule began to walk its endless circle. The shaft began to turn. The gears began to move. There was a grinding sound at first, metal on metal finding its rhythm. Then a rhythmic clicking as the gears meshed and separated. Then the smooth hum of a machine in proper operation. Cotton went in at the top full of seeds and debris and hope. It passed through the rotating drums with their carefully spaced teeth. The seeds dropped out the bottom into a collection tray while the lint was caught by the brushing mechanism and deposited onto the conveyor. Clean cotton began piling up in the collection bin, white and pure and perfect. It worked. God in heaven, it worked. And it worked better than anything the engineers had built. The machine processed cotton faster, with fewer jams, with less waste. Cotton that would have taken hours to process by hand or with the old gin was cleaned in minutes. The design was not elegant by academic standards, but it was effective in ways that mattered. It was robust, forgiving of imperfections in the cotton or variations in power from the mule. It was self-clearing, the wide spacing in the gears allowing lint to pass through instead of building up and jamming the mechanism. It was reparable, built from common parts that could be replaced easily. and it had been built by an enslaved child using nothing but scrap metal and raw intelligence and determination. The engineers stood there, their faces cycling through shock, disbelief, anger, and finally a rage born of humiliation. This was impossible according to everything they had been taught. This violated the natural order of the world. Negroes were inferior. Everyone knew that it was science. It was biology. It was the way God had made things. The shape of their skulls proved it. The texture of their hair proved it. Their status as slaves proved it. They were children in adult bodies, incapable of abstract thought, incapable of planning for the future, incapable of creating anything original. And yet, here was proof to the contrary, running smoothly in front of 24 witnesses. A Negro child had solved a problem that 3 educated white engineers could not solve. A child who was not supposed to be able to learn had taught himself principles of engineering that took most people years of formal study to grasp. Blackwell tried to deny it, tried to find some explanation that would preserve his worldview. He insisted that James must have had help, must have stolen the design, must have somehow cheated. But the other enslaved people stepped forward to defend him, to testify to what they had seen. We seen him working on this for weeks in the night by himself. We seen him collecting parts from the trash pile. We seen him testing pieces, figuring out how they fit together. The boy did this himself. He got a gift from God. There was no way to deny it, no way to explain it away, no way to make it fit into the comfortable lies they had been telling themselves about racial superiority. Whitfield saw immediately what he had. Saw it with the calculating clarity of a businessman who had survived in a brutal economy by being smarter than his competitors. This boy was valuable, more valuable than any field hand, more valuable than any skilled tradesman, more valuable perhaps than anything else on the plantation. Because this boy could solve problems that no one else could solve. Because this boy could take broken things and make them work. Because this boy represented potential that went far beyond picking cotton. And if there was one thing a failing plantation needed, it was someone who could make something from nothing, who could stretch resources, who could innovate and adapt and survive. Whitfield turned to Pettigrew and said, his voice hard and final, "Do not touch this boy. He works for me now directly. He answers only to me. He will have whatever materials he needs to continue his work. And if any of you engineers have a problem with that, you can pack your things and get off my property. I am paying you to solve problems. And all you have done is create new ones. This child has done more in 6 weeks than you have done in 3 months. So either figure out how to be useful or leave." The humiliation burned like acid in the engineers' throats. They had been shown up by a slave child. Their education, their training, their years of experience, all of it meant nothing compared to raw genius and practical understanding. They left the plantation that afternoon, bitter and angry, insisting to anyone who would listen that they had been sabotaged, that the test was rigged, that the whole thing was a fraud designed to cheat them out of their fees. But the machine kept running. Day after day, week after week, James' design processed cotton with a reliability the engineers' machines had never achieved. The proof was in the performance, and performance did not lie. For James, the situation was complicated in ways he was too young to fully understand. On one hand, he had proven his worth. Whitfield treated him differently now, with a mixture of respect and possessiveness that was deeply uncomfortable. He was given better rations, enough food that his stomach did not cramp at night. He was given a private workspace in a shed behind the gin house with tools and materials and a workbench. He was no longer just property. He was valuable property, but he was still property. His genius had not made him free. It had just changed the nature of his bondage. He was no longer a field hand worth $50. He was now a skilled technician worth who knows how much. But worth was not freedom. Value was not humanity. And Whitfield owned him just as completely as he had the day before. Maybe more completely because now Whitfield knew exactly how useful he could be. Rosie watched her son's transformation with mixed feelings that kept her awake at night. He was safer now, protected by his usefulness, but she knew that protection was conditional and temporary. The moment he stopped being useful, the moment he made a mistake, the moment Whitfield decided the risk outweighed the benefit, everything would change. And there was something else that worried her even more. James was starting to believe his own myth. He was starting to think that his intelligence made him special, that he was different from the other enslaved people, that he had somehow earned a better life through merit. She tried to remind him where he came from, tried to keep him grounded. Baby, you are brilliant. God gave you a gift. But brilliant does not make you free. Value does not make you human in their eyes. And never forget that every gift you have came from the people who suffered before you. Your genius is not yours alone. It belongs to all of us. It came from your grandmother who died in these fields. It came from your grandfather who they sold away before I was born. It came from all the people who survived long enough to pass life on to the next generation. You stand on their backs. Never forget that. The weeks turned into months. Spring became summer. Hot and humid and brutal. The war was ending. Everyone knew it. But no one knew exactly when or how or what would come after. Rumors flew faster than facts, spreading through the quarters like wind through cotton. Lee had surrendered. Lincoln had been shot. The Union Army was marching south. Freedom was coming next week, next month, next year. Nobody knew what was true and what was wishful thinking. The uncertainty was torture, worse in some ways than the certainty of slavery had been. People made plans they could not execute. They dreamed dreams they were afraid to speak out loud. They whispered about where they would go, what they would do, who they would find if they ever got the chance. And through it all, life on the plantation continued with a surreal normalcy that felt like madness. Cotton still needed to be picked. Work still needed to be done. And James still refined his machine, making it better, faster, more efficient, proving every day that genius knew no color. It was in late August of 1865, on a day so hot the air shimmered above the cotton fields, that everything finally changed. A Union officer rode up to Whitfield Plantation with a company of soldiers in blue uniforms, carrying papers that made official what everyone already knew in their hearts. The war was over. The Confederacy was dead and the slaves were free. Whitfield was ordered to assemble everyone, all 147 people who had been his property until that moment, and read the proclamation out loud. It was one of the strangest moments in American history. A scene that played out on plantations across the South. Men who had owned other human beings for generations, who had bought and sold people like livestock, who had separated families and destroyed lives without a second thought, were forced by the government they had tried to destroy to tell those human beings they were no longer property. Whitfield read the proclamation in a flat, bitter voice, the words ash in his mouth. By order of the United States government, you are free to go. You are no longer bound to this plantation by law. You may leave whenever you wish. You are no longer slaves. The silence that followed was profound, heavy with 300 years of suffering and hope. 147 people stood in the yard trying to process words they had dreamed of hearing their entire lives. Words their parents and grandparents had died without hearing. Some cried, tears streaming down faces that had forgotten how to cry from anything except pain. Some shouted, releasing emotions that had been compressed for lifetimes. Some just stood there, unable to move, unable to speak, unable to believe it was real, waiting for someone to say it was a trick or a lie or a mistake. James felt something break open inside his chest. A feeling so overwhelming he could not name it, could not contain it. Freedom. The word had been abstract before. A concept, a prayer, something other people had. Now it was real. Now it was his. He turned to his mother and saw tears streaming down her face. Saw her whole body shaking with something between laughter and sobs. "We are free, baby," she whispered, her voice breaking. "We are free. We can leave. We can go anywhere. You can be anything you want." But even in that moment of pure joy, there was fear underneath. Because freedom without resources was not really freedom. Where would they go? How would they survive? What did freedom actually mean for people who had never been allowed to own anything, learn anything, be anything except property? They had no money, no land, no education except what they had stolen in secret, no connections, no safety net. Freedom was wonderful and terrifying in equal measure. Whitfield was not done talking. He cleared his throat and continued, his voice carefully neutral, trying to hide his desperation. "However, I am prepared to offer wages to anyone who wishes to stay and continue working. Times are hard for everyone. The South is destroyed. There are no jobs anywhere. But I will pay fair wages for fair work. It will not be much, but it will be food and shelter and money. And for those with special skills, I am willing to negotiate individual contracts." He looked directly at James when he said that last part, his meaning clear. "I need you. I will pay you to stay. Please do not leave me." Many of the formerly enslaved people left that same day. Within hours of hearing the proclamation, they packed what little they had, which was almost nothing, and walked off the plantation, heading toward freedom with nothing but hope and determination, and the clothes on their backs. Some headed north toward cities where they had heard there was work. Some headed to nearby towns where they had family or connections. Some just walked with no destination in mind because walking away was itself an act of freedom. Others stayed, at least temporarily, because they had no other options. They had no money, no land, no education, no connections. Leaving meant risking starvation on the road. Staying meant accepting wages that were barely enough to survive on, wages that were designed to keep them dependent, to keep them working in the same fields they had worked as slaves. It was not the freedom anyone had dreamed of, but it was better than slavery. It was a beginning. James and Rosie stayed, but on new terms that felt revolutionary, even though they were still exploitative. Whitfield offered James a contract, an actual written agreement that specified wages, working conditions, and a share of any profits from machines James designed. It was still exploitation by any reasonable measure. The wages were low, the terms were one-sided. The profits would mostly go to Whitfield, but it was a far cry from slavery. For the first time in his life, James was being compensated for his labor. He was being recognized as a person with skills and value, not property with a dollar amount. He could quit if he wanted to. He could negotiate. He had rights, limited and fragile, but real. Over the following months and years, James continued to refine his designs and create new machines. He built improved versions of the cotton gin, each one faster and more reliable than the last. He designed a mechanical planting machine that could do the work of 5 men with greater precision. He created a water-powered sawmill that processed lumber with remarkable efficiency, reducing waste and increasing output. He invented a harvesting tool that made picking cotton less damaging to the plants. And with each creation, His reputation grew beyond the boundaries of Whitfield Plantation. People came from other plantations, now struggling farms, to see the machines built by the young Negro genius. Some came out of curiosity, wanting to see if the stories were true. Others came to offer jobs to try to lure him away with better pay and conditions, and a few came with genuine respect for what he had accomplished, seeing past his skin color to recognize true brilliance. But James never forgot where he came from, never forgot the people who had suffered so he could be here. He used his money, every spare dollar, to help other formerly enslaved people. He funded a school in the quarters, a real school with books and slates and a teacher, teaching children to read and write and calculate, giving them the education that had been forbidden to their parents. He hired Marcus the blacksmith as his assistant and partner, paying him fair wages and sharing credit for their collaborative work, making sure Marcus got recognition for the knowledge he had passed on. He helped families buy land, loaning them money at no interest, helping them build lives of their own. And he never stopped working with scrap, never stopped seeing possibility in broken things, because that was where his gift had been born, in the trash pile behind the big house. The engineers who had tried to have him whipped, who had called him a liar and a thief, who had insisted he must have stolen their designs, eventually heard about his success. Some tried to rewrite history, claiming they had always known he was talented, that they had been supportive all along, that they had even helped him in small ways. Others insisted that his designs were primitive, that any trained engineer could have done better, that his success was luck rather than skill. But the machines did not lie. They worked year after year with minimal maintenance. They processed cotton more efficiently than anything else in the region. And in working, they told a story about genius and determination that no amount of racism could erase. A story that challenged everything these men had been taught about who could innovate and who deserved credit. Years later, when James was an old man and people asked him about that day in the gin house when his machine first ran, when he had stood before those engineers and proven them wrong, he would say that he was not thinking about proving anything to anyone in that moment. He was not trying to make a statement about race or intelligence or the inherent equality of human beings. He was just trying to solve a problem with the tools and materials he had available, the same way he had always solved problems. But everyone else saw something more in that moment. They saw a challenge to the fundamental assumptions that had justified slavery for centuries. They saw proof that human potential had nothing to do with skin color or legal status. They saw a boy who had been told he was worth $50, the same as a young mule, show that his mind was priceless, that his genius could not be measured in dollars or contained by bondage. The story of James and his machines spread across Alabama and beyond, carried by newspapers and word of mouth and the memories of people who had been there. Northern newspapers ran articles about the slave boy who had out-engineered educated white men. Abolitionists used his story as proof that slavery was not just morally wrong, but economically stupid, that it wasted human potential on a massive scale. Other inventors, black and white, sought him out to learn from him and collaborate with him. And slowly, grudgingly, painfully, the world began to accept that intelligence and creativity were not the exclusive domain of any one race. It was not a complete victory. Racism did not disappear. The barriers to success for black people remained immense, enforced by law and custom and violence. But cracks had appeared in the wall. Cracks made by a boy with grease on his hands and genius in his head. Cracks that would eventually help bring the whole structure down. Rosie lived to see her son succeed, to see him build a life that would have been impossible under slavery, to see him become a man of respect and influence in their community. She died in 1873 after a brief illness, surrounded by grandchildren she had never expected to meet, in a house her son owned with money he had earned, with dignity in her heart and peace in her soul. Her last words to James, whispered as he held her hand, were simple but profound. "You did good, baby. You took all that pain, all that suffering, all those nights when we went to bed hungry, and you built something beautiful from it. You showed them we are human beings just like they are. Do not ever forget the people who suffered so you could be here. Do not ever forget the people who died in these fields so you could live. Honor them by helping others rise. That is how you repay the debt we all owe to those who came before." James kept that promise every day of his life. He never became famous outside of Alabama, never appeared in the history books that cataloged the great inventors of the 19th century, never got the recognition he deserved from the wider world. But in the communities where he worked, where he taught, where he invested his time and resources and love, he was remembered and honored. He was remembered as the boy who built a machine from scrap when everyone said it was impossible. The boy who proved that genius has no color and knows no chains. The boy who showed that even in the darkest circumstances, even when the world tells you that you are worthless, even when every system is designed to crush you, you can create something that changes everything. The boy who turned pain into purpose and suffering into hope. The machine itself, that first crude contraption built from plantation trash in 1865, was eventually donated to a museum in Montgomery decades after James died. It sits there today behind glass in a climate-controlled room. Its mismatched gears and improvised frame telling a story more powerful than any polished monument ever could. It tells a story about what human beings can accomplish when they refuse to accept the limitations others place on them. When they look at broken things and see possibility instead of garbage. It tells a story about a mother named Rosie who kept her son safe long enough for his gifts to emerge, who fed him hope when there was no food, who taught him dignity when the world offered only degradation. It tells a story about a blacksmith named Marcus who risked punishment to pass on knowledge, who saw something special in a child and decided that was worth protecting even if it cost him everything. And most of all, it tells a story about James, the boy who was told he was property, who was valued at $50 in a white man's ledger, who was forbidden to read or learn or think or dream, who was supposed to spend his life picking cotton until his back broke and his hands bled and he died nameless in a field. The boy who instead built a machine that worked better than anything the educated engineers could produce. The boy who turned scrap metal into hope, turned chains into freedom, turned suffering into triumph. The boy who proved that genius cannot be enslaved, that brilliance cannot be bought or sold, that the human spirit can rise even from the depths of bondage and create something beautiful and lasting and true. That is the story the machine tells. That is the legacy James left behind. And that is why more than a century and a half later, people still come to see that machine and remember the boy who built it and understand that freedom is not given but taken, not inherited but earned. Not abstract but built piece by piece from the scraps of possibility that even slavery could not destroy.